Hello guys, I want to talk about white nationalism and some of the patterns or some of their belief systems. Then I also want to talk about some of the things that whites are not so good at, that white nationalists do not talk about. And that's the main point, is that nationalism is based upon pride. And that pride borders on practical superiority of a race. I have to say it. Some white nationalists may not believe they're doing it, but in practice they are. So let's just go over some of the things that white nationalists are claiming. They're claiming that black crime, lower IQs, welfare dependency across the world are indisputably genetic, because they're global, number one, and blacks have had enough time, there's been enough resources in black nations to make them advance. There's been enough resources in America and other white nations to make black IQs become equal to white IQs. So the only conclusion they can draw is that the African people or people from African descent come from an environment biologically that is not conducive to intellectual achievement on the Western level. Blacks come from a hot climate where there's abundance of food. It's not very hard to survive, and so therefore it did not challenge their mind to plan, do problem solving, and use complicated ways of thinking. Meanwhile, the whites or Europeans that come from a northern background had a shortage of food, had to deal with a cold winter, had to deal with tougher ways of raising their family. So therefore their brains grew larger, more folded, and therefore they're intellectually superior in a Western society that predicated on modernization and advancement. That's their point. So therefore blacks should separate from whites. Let's put it in a nutshell. That's their solution. However, white nationalists seem to think that they have a great history as a European continent. And yes, we can thank them for building some parts of Africa, bringing the Native Americans and blacks into modernization, because Africa and other parts of South America that are not modernized are not very nice places to live. I think that's very subjective, and I think that shows Western chauvinism, because there are many tribal societies that live happier than modern societies. However, let's just take their assumption that blacks should be happy in America because they don't live like Africans. Let's just take that assumption. I'll argue that in the next video. However, there are global patterns of white behavior that white nationalists do not talk about, and they're at the same time span. They exist at the same time span that these patterns of black behavior, global and worldwide, exist. So let's talk about them. White nations overrepresent nations in enslavement. It's very obvious. They have enslaved Africans, they have enslaved Europeans, they have enslaved Greeks, they have enslaved Romans. They tried to enslave a few Chinese, some Native Americans, primarily blacks, but they have enslaved non-white and white people. Over 600 years, they overrepresent. Africans have non-enslaved white people. Arabs, that's back in the day, but in the last 600 years have not enslaved white people. Chinese have, in the last 600 years, have not enslaved white people. What you see in the 600-year history is white nations enslaving other races. They overrepresent in brutal slavery. Yes, some whites have had indentured servants, which they did not whip or shoot, but brutal slavery based upon race, whites overrepresent. Arabs did to an extent. Some Arab countries were involved in that, but they overrepresent. Chattel slavery, generational slavery. Very different from African on African slavery, which was not for a lifetime, was not based upon a race of black people. That's just a fact. I would dare any white nationalist tell me that's a lie. Are you going to try to tell me that did not happen? Okay. Another thing that is not a lie is that white nations, predominantly white nations, for the last 600 years have conquered white nations and non-white nations. India, Africa. They call it colonialism, but I call it conquest because they take the resource. They're using those countries for resources to take back to their own nation. And their justification is because they had the modern mind and that they are intellectually superior in a Western environment. And they probably say that they built that country. And they did all these great things for that country. Well, I can't see it. So, whites overrepresented in that area. White nations overrepresent in exterminating other groups of people. Exterminating or basically mistreating people to a degree which they die, which is called a genocide. If you want to look at the African genocide, African slaves, I think there were 10 million African slaves that just starved on slave ships. Let's just face it, Kevin and many white nationalists have espoused beliefs that justified enslaving people. They used those same type of beliefs to justify, well, the nigger's dead, big deal, he's just a fucking ape. Oh, big deal. He's a savage, he's a violent prone savage, he's a piece of shit. He's just basically a machine. They justified that. So if a black person died, you killed a black person for not being productive enough in the cotton fields. There's really no big deal because he's not really a human being. Dr. Al-Qaeda has said that explicitly. He's told you why he believed that. He used science to justify that. So white nationalists are not happy about the image that I'm projecting. Well, you have white nationalists that are explaining, and I agree, those were the reasons why black people were enslaved, because they were animals. They were seen as animals. We are supposed to believe that we're animals. So, sorry. That's the way it is. White nations overrepresent, again, racial groups that display racial hostility in nations regardless if they're the minority or the majority. South Africa, they didn't want, clearly that's a black country, if we want to go in technical terms, but whites, because they built technology, felt that they should be the privileged class. That's called white capitalism going into a non-white country. But capitalism is so pure and so great. Marxism is evil. That's how racial capitalists define themselves, that they're so great and good. And communism is so bad and so evil. Survival of the fittest is great? Oh, okay. So, you got that in South Africa, probably had that in Zimbabwe. Whites were the majority, but they ran the country. So, maybe I'm wrong about Zimbabwe. So, these patterns have existed for 600 years, and to be honest with you, since the same evidence of having a genetic pattern, whites probably have a genetic pattern. If we're going to accept those global facts about blacks, white nationalists have to accept the global facts about the bad things that they do. You have a tendency to be very aggressive politically. Go into other countries, and you think because you're advanced and you have these technologies that you can enslave people, use apartheid. So I want to ask white nationalists, do you believe that's an evolutionary theory? Why hasn't Philippe Roustan, observed this and try to use science or investigate this scientifically? Because we can't really say that white nations are really, you can't sit there and say, neo-Nazis are crying about how they're perceived, but let's just face it. Neo-Nazis back in the 70s, well, I'll let you figure that out. But that's all I gotta say, guys. Have a nice day.